If you witness the opening of the first archive, your mind already harbors the secret that official history attempted to bury under centuries of tradition and dogma. The child Jesus, at the tender age of 5, not only possessed the divine power to give life to inert clay, but also housed within himself a capacity far more sinister and terrifying: the power to wither the life of a human being with a single phrase, dictated by whim or wrath. After that first fateful day by the river, when the son of the scribe Annas was turned into an empty, withered husk on the dusty ground, a heavy, almost unbreathable atmosphere descended upon the narrow streets of Nazareth. The apocryphal texts, those manuscripts that survived the purges because they contained truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge, lead us to understand that life in the village changed forever. The air itself seemed charged with static electricity, a palpable tension that made skin crawl whenever the door of the carpenter's house opened. The neighbors, simple folk who had seen Joseph and Mary grow up, who once greeted them cordially in the market or the synagogue, now crossed to the other side of the street. They lowered their gaze, fearful of making eye contact, and muttered prayers of protection under their breath when they saw them pass. Mothers, driven by a primal instinct of protection, grabbed their small children tightly, digging their fingernails in, and hurriedly hid them behind their skirts or inside their houses when they saw the small figure of Jesus approaching. What they felt for him was not the respect due to a prophet, nor adoration for the divine. It was pure, primitive, visceral fear that mortals feel in the face of the inexplicable. It was the terror of facing a force that does not follow the rules of nature and can turn against you at any second, without warning and without mercy. For a few days, a tense calm seemed to reign in the village, a sepulchral silence like that which precedes a devastating storm. Joseph, known to all as a just man, hard-working and fearful of God's law, was now a shadow of his former self. He lived in anguish, consumed by a corrosive worry he could share with no rabbi or friend. His nights were sleepless, watching over the sleep of a child who perhaps did not dream as humans do. He tried desperately to keep his son within the safe confines of his house and workshop, watching his every move as if he were guarding a ticking time bomb. Joseph prayed in silence, with faith shattered by terror, pleading with heaven that the uncontrollable power inhabiting the child would never manifest again. But fate, or perhaps the divine and terrible nature that understands neither human precautions nor mortal fears, had another plan drawn out. Tragedy does not need great provocations to erupt. Sometimes, it just needs a small, trivial, stupid accident on any given day to unleash hell. It happened on the village's main street, a road of packed earth and uneven stones, a vital artery where merchants, shepherds with their flocks, and families passed daily. It was a morning that promised to be normal, with the sun beginning to warm the dust of the road and the usual sounds of rural life. Jesus walked alone. He was walking calmly, with that measured pace and distant air that always characterized him, perhaps lost in thoughts about universes and realities that no adult mind could begin to comprehend. The scene described by the forbidden manuscripts is chilling precisely because of its absolute normality, because of how ridiculously easy it could have been avoided had fate wished it so. In the opposite direction came another child from the village. He was a little one of the same age, full of that vibrant, careless energy of childhood. He came running at full speed, laughing perhaps at some game, feeling free and safe in the streets of his home, without really looking where his feet were taking him. It was an instant of pure bad luck, a fraction of a second where two trajectories crossed. The running child tripped slightly on a stone protruding from the path. He lost his balance, his arms flailing for support, and his momentum carried him inevitably forward, colliding forcefully against Jesus' shoulder. The impact was dry. An unintentional collision, an innocent accident. The kind of incident that happens 1,000 times a day on any playground in the world and which, under normal circumstances, ends with a scraped knee, a small cry, a quick apology between little ones, and everyone going on their way. But the child Jesus was not normal. And the reaction he had to this trivial incident reminds us, with brutal coldness, that his psychology did not operate under human norms of empathy or patience. There was no surprise on his face upon receiving the blow. There was no grimace of pain. There was none of the typical noisy irritation of a child who has been shoved roughly. Jesus simply stopped dead, like a stone statue. Time seemed to slow down and then freeze on the dusty street. The sounds of the market seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the other child's agitated breathing. While the little one who had run, still on the ground or trying to regain his balance, looked up to apologize or continue his race, Jesus slowly turned toward him. His eyes, those ancient and profound eyes that texts describe as abysses that had seen the creation of the stars, fixed upon the little mortal who had dared, even by accident, to disturb his sacred path. There were no shouts of fury. There were no lightning bolts falling from the sky nor the earth opening up. It was much simpler and more terrifying. There was only one phrase, pronounced with unnatural calm, with absolute and icy authority that admitted no reply or negotiation. Jesus looked at him and sentenced, "You shall not continue your journey." And reality, submitted to his voice, obeyed instantly. The other child, who was in the very act of standing up, simply collapsed. There was no struggle. He fell heavily to the ground, like a rag doll whose invisible puppeteer has severed the strings of life with a snip. He died on the spot, before his head touched the dust. Without uttering a single moan, without agony, without a chance to understand what had happened. His life was completely extinguished. His young heart stopped beating, simply because he had disturbed for a second the walking of God on earth. Jesus, showing not the slightest emotion, without a shred of human remorse, without even looking back at the small corpse he had left lying in the dust of the road, turned around. He resumed his march toward his house with the same calm pace with which he had come, as if he had just brushed a dry branch from his path. But the sepulchral silence in the street did not last long. Soon, the first witness who emerged from a nearby house saw the motionless body. A cry of genuine horror broke the morning. Panic spread like wildfire through the alleyways. Someone, their face contorted with terror, ran to notify the parents of the deceased child, bearing the worst news a human being can receive. The scene that followed was heartbreaking, a tableau of raw pain. The parents arrived running, hearts in their throats, and found their son dead in the middle of the street. He was motionless, with no marks of violence, no visible wounds, eyes open and glassy, simply extinguished like a candle blown out by a sudden wind. The mother's lament, an animal howl of loss, and the father's shouts of despair and disbelief echoed throughout the village, bringing everyone out of their houses. The unbearable pain of loss, upon seeing the lifeless body of an innocent, soon began to transform into something darker and more dangerous. Unbreakable fury. It was no longer a distant rumor about clay birds or a scribe's son who had fallen strangely ill. Now there was a real, tangible body. It was the second dead child in the village in a very short time, and in Nazareth, a small place where everyone knows everyone else, there was no room for doubt. Everyone knew exactly who was responsible. The connection was undeniable. Where Jesus was, there was unnatural death. The fear that had been contained and repressed for days broke the dam and turned into collective hatred. Neighbors began to emerge from their houses, joining the circle of pain around the parents, sharing their indignation, fueling the bonfire of vengeance. A mob formed in a matter of minutes, a living organism made of anger and fear. Men with clenched fists, women weeping and shouting curses. They were tired of living terrified in their own home. They decided that an end had to be put to this intolerable situation. They could not allow a demonic child, no matter how much he was Joseph's son, to continue killing their own. Armed with their righteous indignation, and perhaps some gathering stones and sticks from the road, the crowd began to march toward the carpenter's house. The atmosphere in Nazareth was one of lynching. They were going to confront Joseph, to demand an accounting in blood for the monster he was raising under his roof. Joseph was working in his small workshop adjacent to the house when he heard the unmistakable sound of an enraged crowd approaching. The sound of quick steps, the rising murmur of angry voices, and the shouts of vengeance froze the blood in his veins. He dropped his tools. He knew with sickening certainty that they were coming for them. Terror seized him, a double terror, fear of those outside and fear of the one inside. The mob surrounded the small adobe house, a human tide of hatred. They began to pound violently on the wooden door, shouting his name, demanding he come out to face them. Joseph, trembling, knowing he had no escape, finally opened the door slightly. He was met with a nightmare vision, the faces of his own neighbors, friends with whom he had shared feasts, synagogue, and work for years, now contorted by hatred and the thirst for justice. The parents of the dead child rushed to the front, eyes bloodshot with blood and tears, shouting at him with broken hearts, "What kind of son do you have, Joseph? Look at us. Since that child has been here, our children die. Everything he touches withers or dies. He is a curse upon this village, and you brought him." The mob, backed by numbers and blind anger, issued a clear, dangerous, and definitive ultimatum. You cannot live with us in this village if you have a son like that. We do not want him here. He is a danger to everyone. Either you teach him to bless and not to curse, or you take your things right now and get out of Nazareth forever, before we burn the house down with you inside and end this evil at its root." Joseph was cornered against the frame of his own door. He felt the hot breath of the mob's terror, which was one step away from lynching them, but looking into the dark interior of his home, he felt a deeper terror, a visceral and ancient fear of the child who was inside, the silent origin of all this misfortune. Desperate, overwhelmed by public shame, the guilt of having brought this upon his people, and the physical fear of dying at the hands of his neighbors, Joseph closed the door and ran inside to find Jesus. He found him in the main room, sitting calmly in a corner, perhaps playing with some wood shavings, with insulting calm, as if nothing was happening outside, as if the shouts calling for his head had nothing to do with him. Upon seeing that indifference, something broke inside Joseph. In a pathetic, desperate, and deeply human attempt to exercise some paternal authority, to regain control of a situation that overwhelmed him, Joseph lunged at the child. He grabbed his ear with rage, with frustration, and yanked it hard, as if rudimentary physical punishment could correct one who holds power over the very structure of life and death, as if pain could teach morality to the creator of the universe. The child Jesus' reaction to his earthly father's physical punishment is the perfect and terrifying closure to this episode. It is a display of power that goes beyond any visible miracle. The child did not cry. He did not shout in pain. There was not a single tear nor a grimace. His body did not even tense up. He released himself from Joseph's desperate grip with supernatural ease, as if the carpenter's strong hand were made of smoke or air. He stood up and looked him straight in the eye. Joseph saw in that gaze something that did not belong to a 5-year-old child. He saw an ancientness and a terrible coldness that froze his blood and stopped his heart for an instant. Jesus opened his mouth and gave him a final warning, with a voice that resonated not only within the walls of the room but in the deepest part of Joseph's terrified soul. "Enough, Father. Do not try to punish me. Never lay your hand on me again. You know well that I am not yours. You know that I do not belong to this world or your rules. Do not provoke my anger, Joseph, or you too could suffer the consequences. You are not my owner, and your human authority means nothing to me." Joseph stood paralyzed, slowly backing away, finally understanding the magnitude of his loneliness. He was completely alone in the face of a power he could not control, a power that lived in his house, ate at his table, and which had now made it clear to him that his life also hung by a thread if he dared to cross him. That day, while the blows on the door continued, Joseph understood the terrible truth of his existence. His role was not to educate that child, but simply to survive his childhood. The mob continued outside, shouting, demanding blood, and Joseph knew with nausea-inducing certainty that if those men tried to break down the door and enter by force, Jesus would not hesitate for a second to use his power against them, unleashing a massacre that would end half of Nazareth in the blink of an eye. What happened then? What did the child Jesus do to stop a bloodthirsty multitude that was about to break down his door? How did Joseph manage to survive that day and seek desperate help to try to domesticate his son before it was too late? The answer is one of the most violent and massive miracles in the Apocryphal texts. Subscribe and activate the bell. In the next episode of the Forbidden Archives, you will witness the brutal punishment the mob received for daring to threaten the Holy Family, and you will see how the first teacher who tried to teach Jesus the alphabet ended up wishing he had not been born. I am the Archivist, and the true hidden story is just beginning to be revealed.